It began with a chuckle, a single offhand joke at an international summit that would spiral into one of the most bizarre diplomatic misunderstandings in recent memory. The conference hall in Brussels buzzed with political energy, global media, and the piercing intensity of leaders gathering to discuss serious issues of global security, migration, and economic cooperation. Yet, amid the suits, formal statements, and tight schedules, one moment of levity, intended to lighten the atmosphere, nearly ruptured an alliance decades in the making. Senator J.D. Vance had only just arrived at the summit, representing a rising faction of the American political right, known for its emphasis on traditional values, economic nationalism, and a sharp tongue that sometimes flirted with controversy. On the other side of the Atlantic, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni had become the face of Europe's conservative resurgence, commanding, pragmatic, and fiercely nationalistic. The world expected the two to be ideological allies. But what happened next tested that assumption to its limits. The moment came during a closed-door roundtable discussion where leaders were encouraged to speak off the cuff, the topic, the cultural clash between American individualism and European social tradition. J.D. Vance, known for blending wit with policy, smirked before saying, "Maybe if Europe spent less time arguing about pasta shapes and more time securing its borders, we wouldn't be having this summit." Laughter erupted from a few corners of the room, mostly American delegates and a handful of Eastern Europeans. But across the table, Meloni's expression didn't flinch. A deep silence fell between them for a fraction too long. She leaned forward, eyes locked on Vance, and replied coolly in Italian-accented English, and perhaps if America understood culture as more than entertainment, it would know the strength of tradition. The words themselves were measured, but the tension between them had thickened. What followed was an international frenzy neither had anticipated. Within hours, the joke had leaked to the press, twisted, exaggerated, and plastered across headlines like "American Senator Mocks Italian Culture." In Vance vs. Meloni, the right-wing rift, pundits speculated on a crumbling alliance. Social media exploded with commentary. Italian opposition parties seized on the moment, accusing Meloni of allowing foreign insults to go unchecked. In America, progressive commentators mocked Vance's cultural insensitivity, while his supporters hailed him as unapologetically honest. Behind the scenes, a wave of damage control swept through both diplomatic teams. Staffers scrambled to craft statements. Vance's communications director urged him to clarify the intent behind his words. It was a joke, not a jab, he insisted. You have to say that publicly. But J.D. Vance, a man who had built his career on not backing down, resisted. If I start explaining every quip, I'll become just another polished bureaucrat. That's not who I am. Meloni, meanwhile, faced her own pressure. Some in her circle wanted her to use the incident to distance herself from the American populist right and assert a more uniquely European conservatism. But those who knew her well saw something else, a quiet reflection. The cultural slight wasn't what bothered her. It was the assumption that Italy, and by extension her leadership, wasn't serious. Their paths crossed again the next morning at a bilateral session. The room was empty save for their aides. Vance approached her with a reluctant smile. "I owe you a moment," he said. Meloni raised an eyebrow. "Just a moment," he nodded. "You and I may agree on a lot politically, but I underestimated something important. You lead with pride, not just in policy, but in culture. That deserves respect." She didn't answer immediately. Then, with a half smile, she said, "And maybe I was too quick to turn a jest into judgment. We're not here to be offended. We're here to lead. That private exchange, short, human, unbroadcast, did more to repair the tension than any press release could." Days later, both issued brief statements reiterating their shared commitment to Western values, unity among allies, and mutual cultural respect, the media circus eventually moved on, drawn away by fresher controversies. But for those paying close attention, something deeper had shifted. The pasta joke incident, as it became known, exposed more than a diplomatic gaffe. It revealed the delicate balance between authenticity and diplomacy, between humor and respect, between national pride and global cooperation. And it reminded the world that even ideological allies must treat each other not as caricatures, but as complex, passionate representatives of rich civilizations. Months later, in a joint appearance at another summit in Hungary, Vance and Meloni shared the stage. She spoke of the importance of tradition, he spoke of bridging cultural gaps, and just before they exited, Vance turned to the crowd with a grin. "I'm still not sure if pen is better than rigatoni," he said, pausing. "But I do know that Italy has the kind of strength America could learn from." This time, Meloni laughed first. Then the audience followed. The room didn't erupt in tension. It lit up with applause. What began as a near crisis became a symbol of growth. It wasn't about who won the exchange. It was about how leaders learn, adapt, and find common ground in the most unlikely of circumstances. And it left a message lingering far beyond the headlines. The real strength of diplomacy isn't in avoiding offense, it's in confronting misunderstanding with grace, humility, and mutual respect. In the polished halls of the Brussels Summit Center, the atmosphere was electric. World leaders shuffled through marble corridors, shaking hands, exchanging stiff smiles, and avoiding the hungry flashes of camera crews waiting outside. The annual Transatlantic Leaders Conference was always a spectacle, a gathering of heads of state and influential lawmakers meant to foster international cooperation. But this year, something unusual was brewing, a tension that had little to do with war, trade, or climate policy. It would all begin with a joke, an ill-timed off-the-cuff remark that sparked global headlines, fierce political commentary, and a test of character between two ideological allies. Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio had arrived late the night before, exhausted from a red-eye flight and a string of domestic media appearances. He wasn't a stranger to controversy. He built his brand on being the anti-elite, the straight-talking voice of the working class. His memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, had catapulted him into public life, and now, in the Senate, he was seen as a rising force on the American right. Conservative, articulate, fiercely protective of American tradition, he was both admired and feared in the political arena. Across the ocean, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni was no less polarizing. She had stunned the world by rising from grassroots activism to becoming Italy's first female prime minister. Known for her passionate speeches about faith, family, and national identity, she stood proudly as a symbol of European conservatism, a movement that many believed mirrored the new American right. Her charisma was undeniable, and her seriousness as a leader had earned respect even among critics. She wasn't just a politician, she was a cultural force. So when both figures were scheduled to appear on the same stage at the Brussels summit, expectations soared. Media outlets called it the conservative convergence, speculating that a powerful alliance might emerge. But what actually unfolded would be far more complicated. The session where it all happened was meant to be informal, a break from formal speeches, giving world leaders a chance to brainstorm freely behind closed doors. A select group of 18 leaders had been invited, including senior figures from Europe and North America. J.D. Vance, with his characteristic swagger, was seated 2 spots away from Meloni, and the topic of discussion was culture and security, the new diplomacy. When it was his turn to speak, Vance stood casually, abandoning the formal notes in front of him. He scanned the room and smirked. With all due respect, he began, Europe could probably get a lot more done if it spent less time debating pasta shapes and more time protecting its borders. A couple of American aides chuckled, a few Baltic leaders smiled, understanding the sarcasm, but Meloni did not. She sat back in her chair, her hands folded in front of her, her expression hardening as the words echoed in the chamber. "And maybe," she responded, her voice calm but piercing, "if America understood culture as more than just entertainment, it would grasp the strength that tradition gives a nation." The room went silent. The tension was palpable, even behind diplomatic smiles. A few leaders shifted uncomfortably. The moderator quickly moved on, sensing the growing discomfort, but the damage had been done. What had started as a joke, meant to reflect Vance's view of European inefficiency, had struck a nerve. Meloni's rebuke was precise, almost surgical. The press, of course, couldn't resist. By that evening, leaks from the closed session were all over Twitter. Headlines screamed across platforms, "Vance mocks Italian culture," "Meloni fires back," "American arrogance," or just a joke. Right-wing rift. Vance and Meloni clash in Brussels. News channels replayed the incident repeatedly. Commentators on both sides of the Atlantic debated whether Vance had gone too far or if Meloni had overreacted. Italian opposition politicians pounced, accusing Meloni of weakness for not immediately defending national pride more forcefully. In the U.S., progressive pundits called it another example of Republican tone, deafness abroad, while Vance's supporters claimed he was being punished for telling the truth. Behind the scenes, the situation was unraveling fast. Vance's team received furious calls from the State Department, urging him to issue a clarification. Meloni's advisors advised her to release a formal statement distancing herself from the senator's views. Even seasoned diplomats privately admitted that the incident had created unnecessary friction at a critical time. But J.D. Vance refused to apologize. "I wasn't insulting anyone," he told his staff. "I was making a point about priorities, and if that's too much for them, then maybe they need to toughen up." His stubbornness, once his greatest strength, had now become a liability. Meloni, too, faced pressure. Her communications team suggested spinning the incident as a cultural misunderstanding, but she resisted. For her, it wasn't just about a joke. It was about what it represented: the casual dismissal of European values, the insinuation that tradition was trivial. She had spent her entire political life proving that cultural identity was not a weakness, but a pillar of strength. The remark, however minor, had struck at the heart of her message. Despite the tension, neither wanted to escalate the matter. They knew the stakes. With war in Eastern Europe and economic instability rising, the transatlantic alliance couldn't afford internal cracks. And so, the next morning, during a brief bilateral meeting arranged quietly by staff, the two leaders met behind closed doors. There was no media, no cameras, just two individuals who had seen their political personas nearly collide in public. Vance was the first to speak. "I meant it as a joke," he said, leaning forward. "But I realize now that what we think is funny can sometimes miss the mark when history and pride are involved." Meloni didn't smile, but she nodded. "Culture is sacred to us, especially when it's been dismissed by the world for so long. But I understand your intention now. Still, you need to know, it matters how you say things." "I do now," he replied quietly. That brief exchange didn't erase the headlines. It didn't stop the speculation, but it laid the foundation for something far more meaningful: mutual respect. A joint statement was released later that day, affirming the leaders' shared commitment to protecting cultural values and national sovereignty, while also emphasizing the importance of respectful dialogue between allies. It was vague enough to avoid further controversy, but clear enough to suggest reconciliation. In the weeks that followed, the storm slowly faded. Media attention turned elsewhere, but inside both countries, the incident left a lasting impression. In Italy, Meloni's approval actually rose slightly. Citizens appreciated her cool handling of the situation. In the U.S., J.D. Vance's base praised him for refusing to back down, while some moderates noted a newfound maturity in his tone. Months later, at a policy conference in Hungary, both leaders were invited to speak again, this time in a panel on cultural diplomacy. The world watched closely. Meloni spoke first, passionately defending national identity and cultural preservation. Vance followed. His speech, while still bold, was more thoughtful. He acknowledged the complexity of tradition, the pride embedded in history, and the need for humor to be wielded carefully. Then, near the end, he turned to Meloni and said, "I may not know my rigatoni from my ravioli, but I've learned there's more to a country than what it debates. There's honor in how it remembers." This time, she smiled. "And there's wisdom in learning what not to joke about." The audience erupted in laughter, not the awkward, nervous kind from Brussels, but genuine amusement, the kind that signals healing. In that moment, what could have remained a bitter diplomatic footnote transformed into an example of how world leaders, flawed, human, prideful, could still grow, still learn, still lead with grace. The world often expects perfection from its leaders. But perhaps the more powerful story is what happens when they fall short and then rise with humility. The incident between J.D. Vance and Giorgia Meloni reminded us that even the most poised individuals can make mistakes. What sets them apart is how they respond when the world is watching, and how they repair what words may have broken. It wasn't just a joke, and it wasn't just an apology. It was a lesson in leadership, in culture, in mutual dignity. And that, more than anything, is what the world remembers. It was supposed to be just another summit, a carefully choreographed dance of diplomacy, polished statements, and rehearsed sound bites where leaders smiled for the cameras and said all the right things. But the 2025 Transatlantic Summit in Brussels became something else entirely, a flashpoint that exposed the fragile egos, cultural tensions, and ideological differences that exist even between supposed allies. In the center of it all stood J.D. Vance, the rising star of American conservative politics, and Giorgia Meloni, Italy's trail-blazing prime minister. They were expected to be ideological soulmates, a united front in a world tilting toward nationalism and traditional values. What the world didn't expect was that a single joke, spoken offhandedly in a private session, could shake their alliance and spark an international firestorm. It began in a moment of unscripted honesty. Vance had just arrived in Brussels, a little jet-lagged, running late to a closed-door round table with several European and North American leaders. Known for his blunt rhetoric and disdain for political correctness, he had long prided himself on speaking truths others won't. When the conversation turned to cultural differences and policymaking, he tried to lighten the mood with a smirk and a joke. Maybe if Europe spent less time arguing about pasta shapes and more time defending its borders, we wouldn't need this summit, he said with a half-laugh. A few in the room chuckled awkwardly, but Meloni did not. Her face didn't flinch, but her silence was deafening. Everyone felt the sudden drop in energy. After a moment, she leaned forward and delivered a cold, cutting response. And maybe if America understood culture as more than entertainment, it would know the strength that tradition gives a nation. The room froze. Diplomats shifted in their seats. The moderator quickly changed the subject, trying to bury the tension beneath another round of policy chatter. But the damage had already been done. Within hours, the exchange had leaked. Headlines exploded across international media. Vance insults Italy, Meloni fires back, read one. Culture war goes global, declared another. American news anchors analyzed it with glee. Italian pundits seethed with indignation. Suddenly, What was supposed to be a show of unity had turned into a circus of cultural offense, nationalist pride, and political finger pointing. J.D. Vance, never one to back down easily, stood firm. When asked by reporters to clarify his remarks, he shrugged. "It was a joke," he said, "and frankly, I think there's some truth to it." His base in the U.S. applauded the candor, but in Europe the fallout was harsher. Italian politicians, both allies and enemies of Meloni, demanded a response. Opposition parties accused her of allowing an American senator to disrespect the nation. Memes and mocking videos flooded social media. Vance became a symbol of American arrogance, and Meloni's credibility as a strong nationalist leader was questioned. Her aides were furious at the optics. A private disagreement had become a global embarrassment. Behind the scenes, diplomatic aides worked overtime. American officials reached out to Italian counterparts, trying to smooth things over, but the media had already turned it into a referendum on nationalism, pride, and transatlantic unity. And in the court of public opinion, perception was everything. Despite their ideological similarities, Vance and Meloni were very different people. Vance was a cultural critic turned politician, grounded in the cynicism of post-industrial America. His experience was forged in the Rust Belt, where survival meant saying what needed to be said, not necessarily what was polite. Meloni, on the other hand, had risen through the fractious world of European politics. She knew how symbolic words could be. For Italians, culture wasn't just a lifestyle, it was an inheritance. When Vance joked about pasta, to him it was a metaphor. To her, it felt like a dismissal of identity. The media frenzy intensified when Vance refused to apologize. "If I explain every joke, I'll stop being honest," he told a reporter. That line played well in certain American circles, but it didn't help the growing firestorm overseas. Meanwhile, Meloni was caught in a political bind. Publicly retaliating would alienate a key American figure. Remaining silent would appear weak. She was furious, but more than that, she felt betrayed. She had defended America in countless speeches, framing it as a partner in preserving the West. Yet here was one of its rising stars mocking the very traditions she fought to protect. She called a private meeting. It was arranged discreetly, just 12 hours after the exchange. No media, no speeches, just Meloni and Vance in a quiet conference room guarded by aides. He walked in, uncertain what to expect. She stood by the window, looking out over the city. "You didn't come here to mock us," she said without turning. "But that's what happened." Vance sighed. "I didn't mean to insult you. It was a joke, but I see now it didn't land the way I thought." She turned to face him. "You think tradition is about food, about old people clinging to rituals. To us, it's about survival. We held onto culture through war, invasion, occupation. It's not cute. It's sacred." Vance looked away, for once without a comeback. "I get it now. I really do." There was a long silence. Then, quietly, she said, "Don't mistake simplicity for stupidity. Our heritage is not weakness, it's armor." The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it changed everything. Later that day, a brief joint statement was released. It didn't offer an apology, but it affirmed mutual respect. "Cultural values are the foundation of strong nations." It read, "and respectful dialogue between allies strengthens those values further." It was diplomatic, vague, and effective. Slowly, the media storm began to fade. The world moved on to the next headline, but those who had paid attention noticed something deeper. In the weeks that followed, Vance's tone subtly shifted. His next public speech referenced the unshakable pride of the Italian people. Meloni, too, gave an address about the importance of humor and resilience in modern diplomacy. A fragile relationship had not broken, it had evolved. Months later, the two appeared again, this time at a cultural policy summit in Hungary. The room was packed. The tension from Brussels still lingered faintly in the air. Meloni spoke first, delivering a powerful defense of national tradition. Then Vance took the stage. He opened with a grin. "I still can't pronounce most Italian dishes," he said, pausing for effect, "but I've learned there's nothing soft about culture. It's what gives people the strength to stand tall when the world changes." The crowd erupted in applause. Meloni smiled, not forced or diplomatic, but genuinely. In that moment, what had once felt like the beginning of a diplomatic incident became a story of growth. It proved that even leaders, especially those with strong beliefs and sharp words, can learn, adapt, and rise above ego. It reminded the world that humor, when misunderstood, can divide, but when redeemed, can heal. It showed that respect isn't about walking on eggshells. It's about listening when your words land harder than you thought. In the end, it wasn't the joke that mattered. It was what came after. The humility to recognize its impact, the strength to have the hard conversation, and the wisdom to turn a rift into respect. And that is the real legacy of the joke that almost caused a diplomatic incident.